Welcome to the Scale the Chaos podcast, where we talk all things contributing to your business dysfunction. I'm your host, Rhonda Lea, a certified Six Sigma black belt dedicated to helping organizations break free from the chaos. In each episode, I bring on industry experts to share their insights, experiences, and practical advice on navigating the challenges of modern business. Today's episode is part one of my conversation with today's expert guest. Be sure to check out the second part of our conversation in the next Scale the Chaos podcast episode. Today's guest is Dr. Kevin Holloway. He is a clinical psychologist for 19 years, specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder and other anxiety disorders, primarily with military service members and veterans. He is currently an international trainer and consultant in evidence-based psychotherapies for PTSD and other anxiety disorders and military cultural competencies in behavioral health care. That is a mouthful. He currently serves as Director of Online Training, Technology, and Telehealth at the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. He is also the host of his own podcast called Practical for Your Practice. He
One of the
also,
hosts. There's three
one
of
of the
us.
hosts, sorry, one of the hosts. And he also happens to be my older brother.
The only credential that matters, right?
Right. I'm really excited about the topic that we're going to talk about today because it actually is a topic that is very relevant to business,
Hmm.
and that is the psychology behind change. Now, a lot of businesses, they experience a lot of change. They have very structured change management systems and processes in place. But what I want to talk about today is the psychology behind the human behavior and the experience with change. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you in, because you deal with a lot of stress related and anxiety. And that's what change causes, right? Change brings on
For
a
all
lot of
of us, right?
stress and anxiety. So I want to talk a little bit about it. But let's talk first about a little bit of your background in
Okay.
psychology.
Like you said, I've been a clinical psychologist for 19 years, and most of my career has been working with service members and veterans, particularly around post-traumatic stress disorder. And like you said, some of your listeners may be going, how is that even relevant at all to what we're doing? And like you said, there's some overlap with regards to stress and stress management. But also, hopefully, we'll talk about a little bit later. It's really relevant to any kind of leadership or management to consider, I don't know, effects or
Hmm.
fallout of trauma. All of us have experienced adversity.
Uh-huh.
That's a given.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And a whole lot of people have experienced trauma. And it
Yes.
doesn't mean that everybody's walking around with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a smaller proportion of people who have experienced trauma, but our experiences affect us and it
Hmm.
impacts how we deal with and react to things in our day-to-day life. And so
And
you're
how we
talking
show up to work.
and how we show up to work.
Yeah.
And like you said, in especially in our work lives, when there's
Hmm.
some major changes happening, everybody's going to react differently. And
Yep.
it's a lot going to be based on what their previous experiences with change or with systems or with
Yep.
leadership have been.
Absolutely. The majority of us, especially in business, we all have those particular team members, right, that are
Right.
more resistant to change than others. And we have those that are gun ho and they really like it. I know from my own experience of management and leadership, there were always specific people that I knew that would be supporters. And then there were some that I knew I needed to give a little bit of information. And then once I gave them information, I knew they were on board. And then
Mhm.
there were those others that it didn't matter how much information I provided to them. It didn't matter how much I talked it up as to what kind of benefit this would provide and how this would, it was the sky is falling,
Right.
life is terrible, I can't believe it. And they're generally those people who are usually looking for something to be wrong or looking for something to complain about. And because every team has these different personalities on them. And so those are probably the ones that are the most difficult
Yeah.
to bring on board with change. So I want to talk about, why do some people resist change more than others, even when they clearly understand how beneficial that change is?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And like you alluded to, there are really a lot of individual differences in people,
Mhm.
right? There are those that thrive on change. Change is exciting to them. There
Yes.
are those who are a little suspicious of change as they're on board, as they understand the reasons, perhaps. Not whether or not they agree with them. Sometimes it just takes understanding it, even if they don't agree, and they can be
Yeah.
on board. And there's those that, like you said, really resist it. I think there's a whole spectrum of
Yes.
responses. And
Oh,
so the
absolutely.
first point, I think, is just that people are
Yeah.
different. People tend
Obviously.
to
Yeah.
deal with change differently. And I think some of that is just hardwired
Hmm.
into us. Some of us have personalities that seek and are excited by change, and some really like to be things to be more the same all the time. I
Yes.
think there's lots of different psychological principles that could explain some of this. And one of them, I think, is even just as simple as optimal arousal theory. Have you heard of this before?
Yes. In our previous conversation.
Because we were talking about this, right?
But prior to that, I had not. So I found it very intriguing.
So optimal arousal theory really is kind of is based on something called the Yerke-Dodson law that people's performance, maybe at work or in education or in
Hmm.
other kinds of circumstances, tends to increase the more like aroused and physiological emotional arousal, not necessarily other kinds of arousal, but the more, if you will, engaged or challenged they are. And probably see that with folks in business that you've
Yeah,
worked with.
absolutely. Yes.
But up to a point. And
Hmm.
after a certain point of increased arousal, then performance starts to drop off again. And
Okay.
so you can almost think of it graphed as like an upside down U or an upside
Yes.
down, probably not a V,
Yeah.
where really low levels of arousal is somebody who is just bored out of their mind. They
Uh-huh.
don't find something interesting at all. And of course, we expect they're not going to perform well, right, in
Yes.
that
Yes.
situation. On the other hand, you've got somebody who is just way overwhelmed
Uh-huh.
with all the situation, the complexity, the things that are contributing to all that arousal, and they're not going to do well either. And there's this sweet spot somewhere in the middle
Yes.
where that level of arousal, that level of engagement is producing highest performance,
Uh,
optimal performance, exactly, optimal arousal theory. And really, everybody's like sweet spot, their optimal level of performance is in a different place for lots of
yes.
different reasons. And
Yes.
sometimes, like we said, it's those individual inherent fundamental things about that person that contributes to that. There's really task complexity is a big one.
Uh-huh.
That a more complex task might actually be more engaging for somebody,
Somebody. Yep.
but the more complex it gets, that also may make it more so arousing that it's hard to perform well. And so we need to break it into smaller chunks, for example. We've heard that in lots of different places.
Yes.
Another is even just environmental factors. Can you imagine doing a very complex task in an environment that's too loud and there's
Uh-huh.
lots of chaos going around?
Yep.
Like some
Yep.
people really need quiet to think and focus, where others maybe thrive in that kind of a circumstance. So
Yep.
lots of things influence where that
Yeah.
optimal level is.
Yeah, and that also brings to light that there's never just one solution. The
Yes.
reason why I
Yes.
mention that is that's actually one of my biggest pet peeves. As I go around and I do various trainings or I read various books on strategy and theories and all this stuff, I hear a lot of, you just have to do this, right? Well,
Right.
you just do this. And it's,
I
okay,
found the answer.
yeah, I have the one answer. You just do this one thing, it's going to solve all of your problems. And while implementing these various theories will provide some improvement because it's going to provide improvement for those that relate to it, but it's not your save all solution, right?
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things that really drives me crazy is when I hear people say, well, you just need to go in and do this, right? And not only that, but even let's say hypothetically, it was just one solution, you very rarely just go do it, right? Like I've had
Right.
people say, you just go and you just set up a sales funnel. Okay, you don't just set up a sales funnel. There's actually quite a bit of steps involved in that. Or you
And to
just
do it
create a
well.
new product, right? You just do all these things, having no idea what it actually takes to do all that. So I love this idea and I love exploring this idea of the fact that there are various different types, right? And I don't know if there's a predominantly and I even dabble in the personality types too. Not that I necessarily was looking to go this direction during our conversation, but there's various different, and I'm not going to necessarily mention them all, but there's various different personality type
Hmm.
systems. And generally they say I think it's a roughly four, maybe some might have as many as six, right? 4 to 6-ish,
Right. Somewhere
depending on
around
what
there.
the
Yep.
system is, right? So depending on these different various personality types is going to depend on what their reaction is going to be.
Absolutely.
And even
Absolutely.
within those various 4 to 6, maybe even up to 8 personality types that there's going to be variation even within those. Because then
Yep.
you're also talking how much there, because there's varying degrees of each of the different types, right?
Exactly.
So obviously we can't touch base for every single one of them, right?
How
Because we're only
long
here
is your
for an
podcast?
hour.
Okay.
But let's talk about, are there strategies that seem to work well with the majority of the population than others?
Yes and no. On the one hand, there's some general things that I
Okay.
think is
Yeah.
good to do regardless, right?
Okay.
And we can come back to that. But at the same time, too, I think it's important, it's incumbent upon leadership to know their team,
Yes.
to understand the people on their team and where each member kind of lands, right? So going back to what you said at the beginning, the people who, maybe their individual differences make it so that their optimal level of arousal is like way up there,
Uh-huh.
and their leader knows that, then they
Yes.
can tailor approaches to change or implementation of things that, recognizing the strengths of those particular individuals. On the other hand, people have a very like lower on the end of the scale where their optimal arousal lands with relatively less arousal. Knowing that too and planning for that can be a big important part of how successfully rolling out change and implementing it there. I'd say the first thing, that the best skill is for leadership to know your team. These are
Yes.
not just interchangeable cogs, right? These are
Yeah, right.
people.
Yes. People who have their own lives, who have
Yes,
had their own experiences outside work, and regardless of how much we want it to or not, it influences how they show up at work, right?
it does.
And
It
it's none of
will.
our business, too, what it is that happened. But
Exactly.
anyway, sorry, I interrupted you, but
No, I think that's a really good point. It is, and maybe it's time to go into that.
yeah, okay.
Let me depart a little bit and just give a little bit of background. So, like you said at the beginning, I'm a trauma therapist, and I see a lot of things through trauma therapy. And there's a difference between trauma therapy and being trauma sensitive or trauma informed. We'll talk about both of these in a minute, but trauma clinically, when we talk about trauma, we're talking about, and this is by definition, it is experiencing actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence.
Okay.
That's it. Actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And it can be experienced directly. Like, it can happen to you. You can watch it happening to somebody else. You can hear about it happening to somebody very close to you. That's what we would consider
Okay.
clinically to be trauma.
Okay.
I'm not here to be vocabulary police, and I'm not going to be like, and if you use the word in any other context, you're wrong and you should change it. That's not
Yeah.
my point. It's
Yeah.
just clinically, that's what we're
Clinically,
talking
that's
about.
where, okay.
And people experiencing trauma, most don't go on to have PTSD, right?
Yes.
It
Something
depends
like
on the
that.
population and the
Okay.
types of trauma. It can be anywhere up to 20%, but that still
Oh, okay.
means that 80% of people who have
Yes.
experienced trauma aren't walking away with PTSD. And it's not
Yes.
that it doesn't affect them.
Yes.
There are some really normal human responses to trauma that just about everybody that's experienced trauma goes through.
Uh-huh.
And it lasts for anywhere from hours to a few weeks after that trauma. And generally speaking, most people return to normal functioning without any
Okay.
intervention from somebody like me. But for some people, they get stuck in that
Uh-huh.
recovery. These kind of temporary but really almost universal responses kind of persist for a while. And
Mm-hmm.
so then in trauma therapy, we're going to be focusing on them doing the things that they need to do to recover, to process this event, to approach rather than avoid, all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Unless we're talking about trauma focused therapy,
Yeah.
then that's not really terribly relevant. Like, in a
Yeah.
business sense,
Uh-huh.
what do you do with folks who everybody's had adversity, a lot of people
Yes.
have experienced trauma.
Yes.
Most of those people don't have PTSD.
Exactly. Yes.
But where it's relevant is that there's I guess it's a newer term that's going around, and I think it's so important. It's called trauma informed care or trauma informed approaches. And
Okay.
these are not limited to just clinical circumstances. We hear about this in the business sector, in education and academia, and law enforcement, and like all over the place.
Uh-huh.
And what it refers to is this idea that we can, instead of thinking about, us go back to the people you talked about at the beginning, right? They're the people that
Yeah.
are really gung ho about change and they're
Yes.
excited and they're on board regardless. You got the people that once they understand what's happening, they can be on board and support it. You got the people that seem to completely resist it no matter what. And you said almost like they're looking for reasons to oppose it.
Yeah.
And I bet there's a temptation at times, I've certainly felt it, to be like, what is wrong with you, to
Yes.
that
Oh,
person?
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. How is it
And
that you can't see what the benefit is, and how do you
right,
not want to embrace this benefit that we're gifting to you?
right. We're bequeathing this change to you. And in some ways, trauma-informed approach would change that question from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you.
Hmm.
And it's not that we have to go dig in their history. We don't have to
Right.
really know that. But it's just a difference in perspective. And thinking about somebody who's having that kind of a reaction,
Hmm.
instead of trying to blame it on some characterological flaw or some
Yes.
weirdness or some,
Personality deficiency.
or intentionally trying to be resistant, to
Yes.
just to be
Yeah.
a jerk. Instead, it's just time to take the approach of, look, everybody's got history.
Yeah.
Everybody's gone through stuff. Is
Uh-huh.
what's happening right now in this change or this circumstance activating some of that old stuff,
Yeah.
some of those old wounds? And
Right.
in some ways, it relates to the term universal precautions has been used a lot. So if any of your listeners are familiar with, like in healthcare, universal precautions usually means like personal protective equipment. When you're drawing blood, you'd wear gloves and maybe a face mask, and always wash your hands after touching a client,
Yes.
and wash your hands in and out of the room, all those kinds of things, universal precautions. And it's not because we assume that every single person has a blood-borne pathogen,
Yeah.
but it's we're going to treat everyone as though they do, because it's good practice anyway. And then we don't
Yes.
have to be intrusive and ask, do you
Yes.
have a bloodborne illness? We're just
Yes.
going to treat everybody as though they do. And it's fine and actually probably useful even for the people that don't,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And it puts their mind at ease because they don't know that the healthcare worker themselves,
Right.
maybe
Or
they
the
have,
last
maybe it's
person
a,
they worked with,
yes,
right?
exactly. Exactly. So
So,
it's not even just about, because I can see some people would take offense. What, you think I have some sort of disease? Why are you wearing these gloves? Why are you treating
right.
me this way? When in reality, it's also to protect you from something that maybe I have, or somebody that I
Absolutely.
previously just worked with might have.
And outside of healthcare, a trauma informed approach would be like the, if you will, the psychological universal precautions. Okay.
Yes.
And so the idea being that we're going to try to be sensitive to the fact that people all have had adversity. We're going to be
Yep.
sensitive to the fact that a lot of people have experienced trauma. All of us have that stuff in our background that can get activated in certain
Mhm.
weird ways that affect how we're responding, how we're behaving, how we're reacting to change. And
Uh-huh.
instead of asking the question, what's wrong with you? We're just
Yes.
internally asking the question, what happened to you? And
Hmm.
how can we mitigate some of that? And so
Yeah.
some of those resistors, for example, might have had experiences in their past where there was a sudden, unexpected change in employment.
Hmm.
They weren't expecting, and nobody told them anything. Or maybe they were told false things that turned out not to be
Yeah.
accurate later on. They
Yeah.
made really big life-changing decisions based on inaccurate information, or not all the information, or
Yeah.
that. And so now when they're hearing about change, it's not necessarily what the manager said or did.
Uh-huh.
It's activating all this old
Honest.
stuff
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. And you talked about earlier, some of us are just hardwired, right? We're hardwired certain ways. It's those previous experiences that have contributed to some of that
Yeah,
hardwiring,
and
right?
that's right on top of the
Yeah.
hardwiring, right? Yeah,
Whether it's been clinically defined trauma or not,
exactly.
it has contributed to our hardwiring of how we react to certain things. The other thing that
Absolutely.
you said that I love is acknowledging that just because somebody has experienced trauma does not necessarily mean that they are having some sort of trauma response. And the reason why I
Exactly.
say that is because that's one of the reasons why we protect health information, is because people make assumptions. They find out that somebody has had a certain condition or has had some sort of experience, right? We make assumptions. And I
Absolutely.
think as soon as you find out that somebody has experienced what somebody would consider a trauma or an adverse experience, people automatically make the assumption that the person is damaged. I
Right.
mean, for years, I was a single mom, right? So clearly I had experienced divorce,
Hmm.
and I was experiencing, single parenthood. Both difficult experiences. They were not things that I could necessarily quote quote hide. And I
Sure.
never tried to. But there were a lot of biases, a lot of assumptions that were made. There were a lot of biases towards single parents, single
Hmm.
moms, especially divorced people, that I had to overcome in the workplace, because people just assume if you've experienced divorce, then you've experienced a trauma. So everything that you do, especially if it's even remotely emotional, it's oh because she's been divorced, or it's
Right.
oh it's because she's stressed. It's not ever because of it's a legitimate emotional response, right?
That's terribly invalidating, right? Like
No,
what you're feeling doesn't count, and I don't have to care about it because it's because of this past thing,
it's nothing
my
to do with
problem.
me. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not my problem, and you just need to get over it, right?
Yep.
And so I think that's one of the things that drives people to remain private and not transparent and not bring
Yep.
their full selves to work is because of those biases. For example, several years ago, I used to drink a lot of Diet Coke. When people tell me how I did what I did as a single mom of four kids and got five people to five different places by 8 a.m., I would tell them I'm powered by Diet Coke. And I legitimately was. I was probably drinking gallons of it, and it started affecting my kidneys. So
Mm.
I had to stop cold turkey.
Mm.
I and everybody in
That's
the office,
hard.
it actually, who has time for kidney failure? So it was an incentive. I was like, I don't have time for kidney failure. So I stopped drinking cold turkey, and it was actually easier than I thought it was going to be. But the whole point was like I was known in the office for drinking a lot of caffeine. Like it was
Mm.
a joke. And I was fine. I was totally fine with that. But I knew that if I made it known in the office that I was going to stop drinking Diet Coke, if anything remotely emotional or anything came up, it was all going to be dismissed as, oh,
Yep.
she's got what caffeine deficiency or whatever. It's because she stopped drinking Diet Coke. So I told no one in the office,
How'd that
and
go?
not one person noticed. Not one person even noticed until it
Right.
was like a month later. And somebody offered me a Diet Coke or wanted to go on a drink run or something for soda. And I was like, no, I don't drink Diet Coke. They were like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Anyways, and I was like, actually, I haven't drank Diet Coke for a month now. So by this time, it had enough time had passed where clearly I wasn't hungover from not having enough caffeine to where I could say that. And I was like, yeah, and none of you guys noticed either. But that was one of the reasons why I resisted
Right.
telling somebody as simple as, oh, I'm going to stop drinking Diet Coke.
Absolutely. They didn't have something to blame it on. They, if you will, they had to take you seriously because they didn't have this easy thing to dismiss it. And so let me be clear. I am not suggesting that leaders or managers should be asking their employees what
Oh,
their
yeah,
traumas are and what
yes.
their trauma history
No,
is
that's not what we're
at
saying at all.
all.
Yeah.
And we're, in fact, what we're saying is that you don't need to know that.
No,
But
yeah,
you can
exactly.
treat everybody as though they've got things that can be activated and be kind, be
Right?
compassionate,
Yes.
be understanding,
Yes.
regardless. Because, like you were saying, as you're coming off of Diet Coke, for example, I'm sure it impacted you a little bit, right?
Oh, yeah.
It probably had an impact on how you were dealing with folks. And it seems
Actually, I
like
felt tons better, ironically,
that's
but
great.
that's another conversation.
Yeah, for sure. That's a different, whole different
A
podcast, right?
whole different podcast. Yeah.
But the thing is that if people were, let's say, treating everybody, let's just say across the board, treating everybody as
Yeah.
if they are coming off of
Coming
a
off a
Diet Coke
Diet Coke.
addiction, right? And not in a judgmental way, but as a, you know what, understand that. I can take that weird thing that person said that I would normally feel offended by and just be like, you know what, I can understand that in a different context. I can drop it.
Yeah.
Imagine if we're just universally applying
Kind
that. That's great,
and
you know?
extending grace to people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, like in a business context, for
Hmm.
example, there's five principles of trauma-informed approach that I think are really relevant that
Okay.
apply everywhere. And the first
Yes.
one is safety, meaning that people are safe to be themselves and authentic,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
it includes, it's not just things like diversity and equity and inclusion. I absolutely support all those things. Like
Mhm.
kind of feeling that you belong.
Yes.
You are part of this team, even though each of us are individuals and are different than each other. We want to create a welcoming environment for
Yeah.
all of our team members. And that doesn't mean that everybody gets away with stuff either. It's
Yeah.
like giving
Absolutely.
consequences equitably, but also
Equitably. Yeah.
compassionately.
I know there's five steps and we're just on the first one,
Right.
but the significance of just giving everybody, creating a safe space, the
Yes.
trust that builds between you and your employees, that amount of trust alone, they will follow you almost anywhere.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, it's interesting because you just, in many ways, predicted the next value of
Uh-huh.
trauma informed approach, and that is trustworthiness.
Yeah.
You as an
Being trustworthy.
organization, you as a leader, you as a team are
Yes.
fostering trustworthiness yourselves and also in your team members, right? So you're providing clear expectations, for example,
Hmm.
of your team
Yep.
members. You're helping them to understand what you expect, what level of performance you're looking for, and not blindsiding them later on.
And
You're
being
informing,
wishy-washy and yeah,
yep.
yeah.
And as things change, you're informing people too, right? So they
Yes,
can trust
yes.
that what they think is the current situation truly is the
Is
current
the current. Yep.
situation. You express patience and acceptance, not that you're going to be putting up with poor performance or violating expectations. That we can be compassionate for people's various circumstances. So that's part
Mhm.
of the trustworthiness. You also have choice, which is a big
Yes.
one. We talked a lot about communication, and that's across many of these, but very often we want to be giving people opportunities to choose when we can.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
in like the situation of a major change, a lot of times our employees aren't part of the discussions, or maybe I don't want to say lower level, but those who are not involved in discussions on change and making the choices and implementing the change may not feel like they have a lot of voice in that. And sometimes
Yes.
they don't by
Yeah.
necessity.
Yeah. And sometimes they don't have enough information to really make the decision,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think one way to help cushion change, if you will, is to be open about the change.
Yes.
Part of that is communicating, hey, these are our reasons. This is the rationale for the change. Some of that can be like, depending on the circumstances, you might even say early on, hey, the organization is considering this change for these reasons. We would love input from all of you about what are the things we're not seeing yet? What are the
Yes.
things we're not considering? What points of view do we need to include as we're making
Yes.
final decisions here? And it doesn't mean you have to accommodate every idea, but
Uh-huh.
as people feel included and
Yes.
feel heard, that can be a really important part of. I'm proud. I'm actually talking about collaboration here, which is one of the other
Yeah.
values, and I'll come back
Yeah.
to choice in a
Yeah.
second. But as people feel heard, and not that their viewpoints have to be adopted to feel heard, just that they were considered
And acknowledged, right?
and acknowledged.
Like
Absolutely.
we've all been in experiences where it's go give your suggestion in the suggestion box,
Right.
right? And it goes
That's
into
this
the black
dark
hole and
hole. Yep.
yeah, and then people stop giving suggestions, right? Or we've always heard, yeah, I know you asked for our feedback, but you never do anything with it, right? That's because okay, maybe the feedback that they gave actually wasn't something that you could implement for
Hmm.
various reasons and they don't have enough information to know that, right?
Yep.
But you need to at least acknowledge that it was received and it was considered.
Yep.
And you don't always have to give justifications, but sometimes it's a good situation to maybe give some understanding.
And we're not saying this means that every organization needs to be a fully democratic organization
Right.
where
Yeah,
everybody gets a
absolutely
vote.
not.
That's
Yeah,
not what we're
no.
saying. But what we're saying is that people, when they're invested in an
Yes.
entity like your organization, your team, whatever that may be,
Mm-hmm.
they we all thrive on feeling like we're contributing, and part of contributing is feeling heard, like our ideas, our
Yeah.
perspective are important even if it's not finally adopted. So many people can feel okay about their ideas not being adopted if they felt like they were at least heard.
Yes, absolutely. Especially if you've already built that trust, right? And they are trusting that you are going to be making informed decisions based off of all the information that you have.
So then let's come back to choice. The last two are
Okay.
choice and empowerment. So choice, again, and if we're talking about trauma focused care in that kind of situation, people that are dealing with post traumatic stress disorder often feel like they have no choice
Yeah.
for anything.
Yeah.
They feel like they are literally being acted upon,
Uh-huh.
like they are just surviving.
Yes.
And that's really common. So a lot of work around treating PTSD is also helping them to regain a sense of control.
Okay.
But guess what? All of us that aren't dealing with PTSD also like to have choices available to
Yes.
us. We
Yes.
love to have
Absolutely.
opportunities to have control over our lives. And
Uh-huh.
that's not to say, again, that you put it to a vote and the employees decide which direction the
Yeah.
organization is going. But if we can present things in a way that there are choices to be
Uh-huh.
made, give people the opportunity to choose, that's great. And I, I give this example to my clients is think about the mother of a toddler, and you probably did this, I did
Mm-hmm.
this,
Mm-hmm.
where if you say to your toddler at the beginning of the day, hey, what do you want to wear today?
Uh-huh.
They can come up with some crazy things, right?
Yeah. Oh
And then
yeah.
you have to shut it down and be like, no, we don't actually wear that out in public,
Yes. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever. And then it feels they didn't have any
Any
input or
say.
any say. But some moms or dads will lay out, let's say, three acceptable outfits,
Uh-huh.
and they'll be like, which one of these do you want to wear today? Right? Now, all three of them are acceptable to the parent,
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter to
Yeah.
them. And the
Uh-huh.
kid gets to feel like they get to select
Yeah.
of the acceptable choices, what works for them. Now, think about applying that in the workplace. I can't think
Uh-huh.
of a great example right now, but if we can give people an option of all acceptable choices
Yes.
as much as possible,
Yes.
give people that feeling of control in their life, that's
Hmm.
really great. And then empowerment is like looking for opportunities to give each of your employees the power to make those decisions and the
Yes.
authority to. Of
Yes.
course, we can't give everybody the choice on everything, but what in their sphere of work, in their sphere of influence,
Uh-huh.
should they be given the opportunity to be empowered to?
Make decisions. And if they don't have the skills to do that, as
Yeah,
their business leader, you're responsible to help them develop those skills and
right.
practice them, right?
Which leads to more empowerment, right?
Exactly.
When they have those
Yes.
skills on board. Now, the one thing I would also throw in there too is all of this, it's not directed only in one direction. It's not just towards the employee. This is stuff that we can implement on all levels, on the organizational
Yes.
level, at the management level, and frankly, going the other direction as we're implementing change and we
Uh-huh.
feel like we've considered all of the variables and this is the direction we're going to go and we're going to roll this out. And we've been
Yep.
really communicative and we've given people choice and we've considered those alternative points of view. Some employees are going to be like, that's not what I signed up for. I'm out.
And that's
And
okay.
that's okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
okay. That
Yeah.
we want to empower people to do that too.
Yeah.
Now that
Because
might cause us some problems,
yeah.
and we need to deal with that. The fact is that people are autonomous people and they can
Yep.
make decisions about what is good for them, and that's part of the change process too. Giving
Yes.
people information that helps them make informed decisions is an important part of that change process.
And recognizing that the employees have just as much of a right to make the decisions as the organization does. And it also doesn't mean that it needs to create conflict. We can all
Yep.
agree to disagree at some point
Sure.
and not question people's loyalty
Yep.
because maybe they're agreeing to disagree.
Or their work ethic
Yep.
because they want to go work somewhere else that doesn't have these changes.
Yeah. Or whether they're not a real team player. Maybe they are a team player on the team that they feel
Fits.
fit. Yeah, that they fit
Yeah.
on.
Yep.
Exactly.
That's the thing. And nobody at any of these levels needs to take this personally.
Yes.
Because most of the time, and I think that's another point of this trauma-informed approach, most of the time, this isn't personal.
Yeah.
This is about that individual and their experiences and how things are landing on them and what it's activating for them and the decisions they need to make that are good for them.
Yeah.
And by doing this trauma-informed approach, like I said, it's at all different levels. It isn't also just in communication patterns, for example. It could be the physical environment. How is your
Yes.
office or your warehouse or your workplace set up? Is it set up in a way that is focused on these values of safety and empowerment and
Yeah.
choice and control and all those kinds of things? Trustworthiness. It could be your policies. It could be your HR policies, for example. Which forms do you have them fill out when they are joining your organization? Some of them are required by law. Got it.
Some of them, yeah.
Some of them are because you want to see goodness of fit. Like we said before, you're not asking people what their trauma history is. That's
No,
not none of
yes.
your
None
business.
of your business. Yeah.
But also, there are some questions that are possibly, or some forms or some things we might be getting as people are coming in that might be unintentionally activating some trauma stuff, right?
Yeah.
A lot of us have to take a drug test when we're starting somewhere new.
Uh-huh.
Well, what about how does that land on? And I'm not saying you should exempt certain people, but how does that land on somebody who, let's say, a parent
Mm-hmm.
died by an overdose?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or somebody who did struggle with substance abuse previously in their life and they're not struggling with it now, but this is activating memories of having to take drug tests repeatedly as part of conditions of staying unincarcerated or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting you have to get rid of certain questions, but think about can you implement them in a way
Yes.
that regardless of who it is, and you don't have to try to pick out who has the drug history or who doesn't or who has the trauma history, but that would land softer on
Yeah.
folks that are struggling with that.
And I've also seen some situations where, because the individual's trauma was well known, they have been left out of certain situations. They think it's good intentions because, oh, this might trigger this person. So we'll just leave them out of this discussion or this decision. Or how about you just have the discussion or the decision or whatever it is that you're doing in a way that doesn't trigger their trauma?
Exactly. And in fact, how much more valuable to have that person's insight,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Because if you have an employee that has such history or it may impact them certain ways, I guarantee you have customers who do too.
Yep.
And so, wouldn't it be great to have an informed perspective that will help you to address the needs of your customers better or whoever your clients may be because you have that perspective?
Thank you so much. This has been an
Oh,
amazing conversation. I know you're not necessarily out promoting anything, so I'm not going to necessarily send people to your website or to come go find. You're on LinkedIn, but you never post anything on
it's true.
LinkedIn,
I
except
don't.
sometimes you post your podcast, but that really is only applicable if you actually are a clinical psychologist. So you really were just coming on here for us to have a fun conversation, an informative conversation about this topic around change. So I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
That wraps up this episode of Scale the Chaos. A big thank you to our guests for sharing their expertise and actionable insights. If you found value in today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. Your support helps us bring more conversations like this to business leaders like you. To find out more on how you can scale your chaos, you can go to my website at www.scalethechaos.com or connect with me, Rhonda Lea, that's Lee spelled Lea, on LinkedIn. Join us in our next podcast episode for part 2 of today's conversation as we continue to tackle the challenges of organizational dysfunction and help you transform chaos into scalable success. Until then, stay focused, stay inspired, and let's scale the chaos together.